I'm sure if you ask around, somebody will tell you how old he is. Anyway, we're going to start off with some lightning talks, and our first lightning talker, and I'm looking around for him someplace over there. Michael, oh, there he is. Different colored shirt today. Michael Sinatra from University of California, talking about life with DNS and the DLV. As I sit here and fight with Michael.
Okay, thanks a lot. My train gets me here about 1 minute to spare, so I just ran into the room. I realize it's DLV and not the DLV, but I'm just trying to be cute here and make it sound like my life with the mob. And I don't want to in any way imply that DLV is anything like the mob. I assure you it isn't. So I'm not going to really talk too much about what DLV is. I think most of us know, and if you don't, you can use these slides for reference. I'm just going to skip right on through them. Suffice it to say that what DLV allows you to do is deploy DNSSEC in the absence and do DNSSEC validation on your caching resolvers in the absence of a signed root and or signed TLDs, and it provides a mechanism for you to do that without having to maintain your own trust anchor repository. So why would we do this? Who wants to deploy this stuff early? Well, I didn't actually learn everything I know on the New York City subway, but I was in New York over the weekend, and after a very long night out with friends, I was on the subway the next day, and I found myself very close to one of those subway preachers. And to the extent that I could make out what she was saying, one of the things she did talk about was that, you know, a lot of people talk about doing things, a lot of people talk about being a particular type of person, but sometimes you just have to do it and stop talking. And although I like to talk a lot, obviously, and I like to send lots of emails and participate in mailing lists, I figured if I put some of that energy into actually deploying something, that would be kind of useful for folks, including me, of course. And I also believe that about IPv6 as well. Obviously, that's not without some risk, but I have been able to remind my management that part of the role of a research university actually is public service, and we should be providing a sort of testbed environment for interesting and new and innovative things, especially as they pertain to the internet. And Berkeley has done that in the past. We have a very different role today than we did in the past, but it's good for us to continue doing that. So what did we actually do? About a year ago, at the time of the Kaminsky vulnerability, when that was all sort of starting to blow up, we began a testbed for doing DNSSEC validation with the DLV, or with DLV. And that process led to the eventual implementation in production by the end of October 2008. We were doing validation on all 8 of our caching resolvers. We have 8 caching resolvers in 2 Anycast clouds. I think most of you know what that would refer to. So that's when we started it. And it's been going since then with 1 or 2 interruptions. This is actually not quite right. It's more like 2 failures in about 9 or 10 months that we've actually been paying very close attention to it. So, or really about a year, because that's when we started testing. So it's actually been, I think, fairly reliable. No one expected it, or at least I didn't expect it, to work right out of the box, that we would have a brand new protocol and a particularly interesting way, and you can interpret interesting however you want, particularly interesting way of implementing that protocol when it comes to DNSSEC validation. We didn't expect we would do that and that it would just work. And it didn't necessarily just work, but it's actually worked pretty well. Now I'm going to gloss over these failures because this was the problems that we had, the glitches. I'm going to gloss over those because this is a lightning talk. They're interesting and there's a lot to talk about. So if we want to talk about it later, you know, come up afterward. I'm around after after we end at noon or at before 1. But at any rate, suffice it to say that the impact of some of these was, for example, for the first one, you couldn't resolve names in Gov for about half a day. That's kind of important for Berkeley because we have Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, which is a .gov, and we have Lawrence Livermore National Lab, and we actually have faculty who are affiliated with those and get their email at those institutions. So that's a big deal for us. This turned out to be an error in the way that bind versions handle, certain versions of bind handle DLV keys that they don't understand, they don't support. Instead of treating that as an insecure zone or an insecure situation, they treat it as a validation failure, which is obviously a significant thing. The second issue occurred when the DLV.isc.org zone was sort of missigned. The process that ISC uses to sign it didn't work correctly, and I won't go into huge amounts of details there, but the result is that a client caching resolver with the proper trust anchor key for the DLV zone would have treated any query to that zone, any response, as a validation failure. Because your caching resolver needs to use DLV for every query it does, eventually that caused every query to the caching resolver to fail. So this was obviously very significant. At the same time, the response that ISC made to both of these problems was really very, very good. The patching work that was done for bind was not only completed from ISC's end very rapidly, but actually got into a number of operating system distributions by the end of the week that particular problem happened with Gov. And the response on a Saturday night to the second problem was actually very good as well. I was actually at a bar in LA and I had to walk an engineer through disabling validation. ISC actually did all the work to fix it. So obviously, why did I do this, given that there are some, obvious issues and there are some obvious controversies? What has made me stick with DLV? I put these quotes up here for your reference. I actually agree with a lot of them. I think they make very good points. I'm going to sort of gloss over David's point here and go right on to one very interesting point that Randy has made regarding trust. How do I trust DLV to do the right thing with keys? I have to trust it really on two levels, and that's sort of what David's point gets to as well. I have to trust it on the level of these keys should be the right keys, they should be valid, what kind of vetting process is used to get the keys into the DLV repository, and also how do I trust ISC to run their infrastructure correctly, because now my infrastructure relies on their infrastructure in real time. And my answer is partly contained in their response to the previous problems that happened in the past. I'm not necessarily concerned about everything being perfect the first time, but it's how quickly do you fix it? And ISC has been extremely responsive in fixing the problems that have come up. I don't have a really great answer to the question of how do I know to trust somebody that they're going to put the correct keys and they're going to put keys that they vetted in there, other than I have some knowledge of how ISC's process works. I have some understanding of how it works. Not everyone does, and I realize not everyone's in the same position topologically with respect to ISC. I have a pretty good, peering with them, pretty good infrastructure with them. So there's a lot of particular things about my situation that I can actually trust ISC on a variety of levels. I realize that's not true for everyone, but it comes down to a personal decision. You have to decide who to trust, anywhere in the internet. What PGP keys do you trust and who signs them? Those sorts of things. I think this point is also very interesting regarding the fact that I have made decisions that are sort of causing my users to be captive to my decisions. I take a great deal of responsibility for that. The art students at Berkeley, as David points out in this quote, are using my name service. They need to rely on me to make the right decisions. That's extremely important. They can't just choose. The art history students, by the way, they actually use Unbound, and the dance students are maintaining their own trust anchor repository, and the drama students are actually implementing DNS Curve, but they're drama students. So anyway, I made that was the joke portion of the talk. I made the decision to trust ISC. I stand by that decision, and I also take responsibility for it. And management, even in the case of the current failures, management has been accepting of that. If there continue to be bad problems, and I should say not continue because most of these problems are in the past, there haven't been any recent problems. If there were to be problems, I'm sure I would get some questions as to, is there a way you can do this that isn't quite as impactful? But so far, things have gone well, and so far I'm still being supported by management. So I'm going to just sort of let you read this because I'm just about out of time. I think one way to improve the kinds of dependency issues that David Conrad identified is to allow zone transfers or have some mechanism for hopefully an in-band, but even an out-of-band grabbing of the DLV zone or of a DLV repository so you can use it locally instead of having to query to someone else's infrastructure for every query that you make. I know that there's aggressive caching going on, but essentially you have to rely on someone else's infrastructure. I think zone transfers would go a long way, or some similar mechanism would go a long way toward fixing that. There are lots of ways you can do it on your own with lots of little scripts that pull keys out of different places and put them in your own trust anchor repository, but there are also lots of things that can go wrong with that. I think the zone transfer type of mechanism gives you some of the best bang for the buck in terms of reliability. And that slide is duplicated. Obviously what I've learned, a lot of this stuff I learned, by the way, putting it on my home network. I recommend you do that. Even if you don't want to implement it in production on your work network, put it in your home network. Use the DLV repository that ISC has or one of your choice. Turn it on. You learn a lot just from doing that. And I already talked a little bit about firewalls. We know that firewalls are a pain in the butt. It's not just 512 byte limits, it's also fragmentation. They need to understand fragmentation. And I think the rest of it's fairly self-explanatory. So thanks a lot. And by the way, I wrote this slide a little while ago. I wish there had been more tasty cakes, actually. We are in Philly. Thank you.
Actually, by my watch, you hit just about on the button. So we got one person in line, so I think we better.
Okay.
Just a couple of questions, but we're short on time, so.
Yeah, Keith Mitchell, ISC. I'll keep it quick because they're not actually questions. I'd just like to thank Michael for his presentation and his persistence and patience in making DLV work. Really appreciate the feedback. Deploying DNSSEC is a learning experience for everyone, and we have to keep clicking away at this stuff. Just to follow up on a couple of points. Yes, we will be making DLV data available via zone transfers. We're working on setting that up now. And we're also working with a number of large-scale DNS providers to secondary the dlv.isc.org zone authoritatively so that that's reducing one of the single points of failure. So, we're learning too and taking points on board.
Thank you.
Hey, Ed Lewis from New Star. I'm curious to know, and this is expert, not just for you, but for other people in the room, if you want to request a server, how would you like to get the keys to trust? Is this a really good way to do this? Are there better things we can do? Because we have to advertise our keys at some point. If it's not signed, we have to go directly to the operators.
Let me be very brief about how I feel about that. One of the issues or the sort of trade-off with me, and I'm not probably going to be able to answer the question directly, but it's simply a question of how much do I trust myself in terms of being able to maintain my own trust anchor repository and not let keys expire, especially if I've got a lot of different keys. In some cases, I actually would rather outsource that process. So having someone like ISC do it is actually more trustworthy than having me do it in a certain respect. I know that doesn't answer your question directly, but that is one way I would like to see it, is going into either ITAR or some place where ISC can get it and they can put it in their DLV.
Thanks very much, Michael.